First of all, let me thank you once again, Minister Navracsics and Mr. Goodhart, for accepting our invitation. It is a great honor for us to hear your thoughts here. If we dive into the details, Mr. Goodhart, perhaps it's not an exaggeration to say that your book presented tonight belongs to one of the few works out there that doesn't try to explain the occurrence of populist politics along the lines of liberal cliches. Instead, in your work, you have defined a new fault line using a completely new terminology. So please introduce us to the world of somewheres and anywheres and to the reasons behind the emergence of this kind of tribalism.
Well, I'll do my best. Thank you for the very generous introductions, and thank you to Századvég for publishing my book. As has been explained, I actually did write this book back in 2016. I actually started writing it just before the Brexit vote. It was ideas I'd been thinking about, ideas about the, not quite the transcendence, but the kind of evolution beyond the normal politics, class-based politics, in which economics is the primary motivator, the primary movers are social classes. And while that obviously still has some relevance, had some relevance in 2016, still has some relevance today, the new divisions that had emerged that clearly needed some kind of labelling, divisions much more related to culture and levels of education. I mean, you've already heard a rough description of what anywheres and somewheres are, so I won't repeat that, but except to say that another way, I guess, of saying anywhere is to say liberal graduate, of which there are many more now than there were in 1980 or 1990 or even 2016. People who are mobile, and in the UK particularly, we have an overwhelmingly residential university system, so everybody leaves their hometown, the people they grew up with, and moves somewhere else, you know, to London or Manchester or wherever. So there's a sort of anywhere way of life, if you like, that is much more mobile. And people who live mobile lives often find social change more comfortable than other people. They like openness and autonomy and novelty. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, I think we should be absolutely clear that the anywhere worldview and the somewhere worldview are both perfectly decent worldviews, at least in their mainstream forms. They both have extreme forms that are perhaps less acceptable, but they're both legitimate worldviews. The second one I haven't really described, somewheres, but just very briefly, somewheres who tend to be more numerous than anywheres. I mean, very roughly, when I was writing the book, and by the way, I invented these labels, but I didn't invent the world view groups, the anywheres and the somewheres, and indeed the in-betweeners. There's a very, very roughly, when I was writing in 2016, as I say, I started writing just before the Brexit referendum, and I finished writing just after the Trump election at the end of 2016. And the book then came out originally in England in March 2017, which is one of the reasons why it did quite well, because it was one of the first books to come along with a sort of general explanation for Brexit, Trump. It was a kind of trying to be a sympathetic understanding of what was called populism. Yeah, sorry, just to roll back to, so at that time, I mean, I had my nose buried in the British social attitude surveys and lots of other opinion and value surveys, and I drew out these categories, as it were, from the raw material of opinion surveys. So in quantity terms, anywhere's it's a fuzzy concept. It's got fuzzy edges. Although somebody flattered me enormously by saying I'd invented Weberian ideal types, I don't know, any of you are students of Max Weber. I think that might be slightly exaggerating, but anywheres are about, or were about 25% of the population. Somewheres, the less educated, more rooted, people that tend to prioritize security, familiarity, tend to be relatively uncomfortable with rapid change, but comfortable with tradition in many respects. Now, there are many kinds of anywheres. There are many kinds of somewheres. Moderate anywheres and moderate somewheres probably don't disagree about a huge amount. They will disagree about some things. There's a group in the middle, as I say, called the in-betweeners, who roughly share both of these worldviews. But sorry, back to the basic point. Both of these worldviews are perfectly decent. It's just that one of them has been overwhelmingly dominant in rich countries, really, particularly in Western Europe and North America, for several decades now, and it's unbalanced our politics. And populism was a sort of often rather poorly led, often rather incoherent pushback against the over-domination of the anywhere worldview. And I think, well, this is something that we will probably come on to later, but I think it's interesting to try and, as it were, apply my value divide, my worldview divide view of politics, not just to the Brexit vote itself, which I sort of did in the book, but actually to the mess that we have so far made of the Brexit process, because the truth is that no one expected the Brexit vote, and very few people in the British elite wanted it. So we had Brexit without a plan, or with various different plans from the various sort of subgroups that supported Brexit, but we didn't have a cadre of qualified people to implement it. All the civil servants were Remainers, and it's actually an illustration of an idea that's not mine, this idea of the two constitutions. It's the American writer, conservative writer Christopher Caldwell has talked about the two constitutions. The first constitution, and the most important, is the democratic electoral process and the rule of law, the basics of democracy. The second constitution is all the other ways in which power and influence is manifested in our societies. It's the media, it's the civil service, it's the civil society more generally. And that tends to be completely dominated by anywheres. So even when somewhere governments win elections, or somewhere influenced ideas dominate in an election, they often don't then get implemented. And actually Brexit is a kind of classic example of that. It's very early days, and we've only had Brexit for, barely 2 years. So it's far too early to make any big judgments. Obviously, there are going to be some economic costs to it. I suspect that in the long run, the economic costs won't be that great, and we will at least be a full democracy, which I'm afraid I can't say about members of the European Union nation states. You are kind of semi-democracies in a way. You've given away a huge amount of decision-making. I know you're doing your best in Hungary to stop that and to bring the decision-making back, but you are semi-democracies. Anyway, that's perhaps another subject. But I'll leave it there, shall I?
Thank you. I think that answers our questions. Getting back to the issue, as you mentioned, social mobility, and Minister, this question would be aimed to your expertise. Given your wide experience in domestic and European politics, through the years you have surely perceived certain challenges regarding issues discussed in the book, such as the question of identity, rootedness and social mobility, especially within the framework of the EU, a system that some might call the elite project of our time. From a voter's point of view, would you agree that these factors can easily become the defining elements of a potential populist revolt? And if so, how do you think politicians in general think about these topics and challenges?
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for the invitation. It's my honor to be part of this debate and to try to couple the Hungarian experience to the British one. Yes, indeed, the European integration is basically, from the onset, is a kind of elitist project. And it was going to be an elitist project, actually, because it was designed to be an elitist project. However, there was another route, the Christian democratic route, which had the ambition to convene the peoples of Europe, post-war Europe, and build up a peaceful Christian community at European level. But as we could witness, it failed. And now this technocratic kind of the future scenario of the European integration is the overwhelming. But it has a huge problem, and that's the lack of identity. If you want to have a political system, it's not only a set of institutions, it's not only a bunch of regulations and legislation and products of legislation and so on and so forth, but it has to have a soul or a heart or something like that, a political community, a democratic community, which is based on identity. If we have a common identity, I mean, we Hungarians have a common identity, probably it's slightly different than the British one, because the British identity as such is a supra-ethnic identity, if I understand well. However, it is in crisis now. I mean, it's above ethnicity. You have the English tribe, the Welsh, the Scottish.
Not multinational, it's a kind of multinational.
A kind of multinational, yes. But I think it's important that it's above ethnicity, while the Hungarian identity is based mostly on an ethnic identity. And the issue of language is very important for us, for instance. And it has very serious consequences and long-term consequences for Hungarian politics as well. If you follow the Hungarian political developments, it's almost debates, there are almost debates about the existence of the nation, the future existence of the nation, and the language, and the culture, and so on. So it's an identity-based politics for centuries now. While the British identity might be different, but I think it is a good pretext for understanding a possible or impossible European identity. And that's the main problem of the European identity, the European integration, because the European integration is now facing the problem of identity, because without identity, they cannot build further this European political architecture. I think it's pretty clear. The political debates we are witnessing now at European level are getting closer and closer to the questions and debates of identity. The migration policy, the East-West divide, all the problems of supranational political institutions, the legitimacy of the EU institutions, the relevance of the European Parliament elections next year, for instance, are related to the questions of European identity. And I think your division on somewheres and anywheres are very important in that respect as well. Because there it's not restrained only to national framework or to national political arenas, but also it can be also a political debate at European level. What makes a European identity? Is anywhere an exclusive part of the European identity, or can be a somewhere identity in the framework of the European identity. And that is very important also for us, and for the future Hungarian politics, for instance. While probably because we've had an identity-based politics since 1990. There were no class divisions in the post-communist political world, just because during communism, all these classical political cleavages were so blurred and chaotic. So I would say that your division has prevailed since the democratic transition in Hungary. I know as a politician that when we look at the election results, you can see also in Poland, but in Hungary, that if you take the more urbanized areas of the country, or the parts of the cities where the block of apartments, block of flats, or concrete buildings were prevailed, their population, regardless of their education, the population was more inclined to be anywheres. While in traditional areas, or in Poland, the eastern part of the country, the traditional parts of the interwar Poland, citizens or voters were more inclined to be somewheres. So I think your division is very useful for interpreting East or Central European politics as well, just because they have been based on identity politics and identity elements.
Yeah, can I just sort of, no, I think that's really interesting what you say. And in fact, I meant to preface my remarks earlier by saying that actually a lot of what I'm writing about, I think, applies more to North America and Western Europe than it does to Central and Eastern Europe. But actually, you're sort of, in a way, saying that that's no longer true. It might have been true going back to the 1990s, but you now do have, you've seen these anywhere, somewhere divisions emerging very strongly in recent years. But what also struck me about what you were saying was the importance of having strong national identities, whether ethnically based or more civically based, in a sense, is an accident of history. But if you have a really strong collective national identity, then it frees you to have a much more adversarial politics, in a way, without the process breaking out into violence or breaking. I mean, if you have a strong national identity, you accept that the other guy wins the election and that your priorities will take second place for the next 5 years or whatever. It allows for pluralism. It allows for the conflict. Obviously, all of our societies have huge conflicts of interest and values, and that's what it is to live in pluralistic liberal societies. But for that game to be played in a coherent and peaceful way, you need strong national identities.
Yeah, you're right. I think in optimal case, democratic politics needs to have a wide consensus in the culture or somewhere in identity, in national identity. But and it might be the case in nations which have more peaceful history, I would say. But the Central European nations, there's an eternal point of division on politics, how to behave with foreign powers or with the neighborhood, with the dominant neighborhood powers. For instance, Austrians for Hungarians, Germans for Poles, Russians. And there are the question, the very sensitive question is who serves the nation better and who is the traitor of the nation. And we have long stories about that. And all the political debates are, if you take a Hungarian political debate, that you will find in the sixth or the seventh page of the debate is the question: who is the traitor? And so there's no cultural consensus behind the political debates. Of course, if there's a multi-ethnic or multinational background of democratic politics, to break a consensus or to make a consensus is much more difficult, but it's not easy even in homogeneous terms as well.
Yeah, which leads one to think. I mean, one of the things I often say about politics looked at through the anywhere, somewhere lens is that you need a new generation of politicians who are able to transcend the division, or at least to bridge the divide. It doesn't matter what their own sociological background is, whether they're from an anywhere or a somewhere background. And we haven't really done that yet. We have politicians who are very much, I don't know, a populist like Nigel Farage in Britain, speaks for the somewheres, and I don't know, almost all the other mainstream politicians speak for the anywheres. We haven't yet generated a style of politics or a kind of politician who can bridge the divide, and that's what we urgently need to do. And I guess Hungary is much more of a somewhere nation than the UK is, but you also have powerful anywhere interests that need to have their interests reflected to some degree in the consensus. No.
Yeah, can I go on? Just
absolutely, please.
Because we're just expropriating the whole debate. But yes, I think I would say that there are two factors which makes us more somewheres than anywheres. First is the communist legacy, that for 50 years there was no opportunity to go abroad, to study abroad, to teach, to learn foreign languages, to communicate with the peoples of West European countries, and so on and so forth. So it made us more somewhere. Of course, our societies are more traditional per se, but that's one important factor. And the other one is the language, the Hungarian language. I just picture sometimes that how big advantage is to be a British, to have a mother tongue which is used anywhere and everywhere in the world. If you want to go to Chile, for instance, or to Iceland, you can work with your mother tongue. You can teach your mother tongue, but what can I do with my Hungarian? So even the cultural...
There is a Hungarian teacher here.
Okay. But where?
No, you're right.
Where?
Yeah.
Okay, but where do you work?
Actually, he taught around the world, including South Korea, Serbia, New Zealand.
Some people do want to learn Hungarian.
Okay. That's good. Okay.
Anyway, no, you're right.
There's no mass demand, I would say.
It is a great advantage, with the small disadvantage that it means we're very, very poor at learning foreign languages. And I lived in Germany for 3 years and speak reasonable German on a good day. And it is a lovely thing, learning other languages. And most British people don't have, in a sense, the sufficient incentive to do it. So, but I agree. I mean, it's mainly a huge advantage.
Getting back to the book and the topics discussed in it, Mr. Goodhart, my impression is that you attach more weight to the socially cohesive power of cultural issues. And in your book, let me quote you, "The fault lines of the new tribalism are cultural and not just economic." What do you think could the ever-divisive question of the idea of a fully open society, as well as the issue of probably mass immigration, be one of the driving forces behind this cultural tribal division?
We had Brexit because the anywheres, kind of, the liberal graduate class, if you like, another shorthand term, over-dominated our politics, and their priorities, probably from the kind of 1990s until the kind of until sort of 2015, 2016, and even to this day, really. So just to give you a few examples, I mean, their value priorities turned into policy priorities would include things like the huge expansion, I would say over-expansion of higher education. All anywheres have at least an undergraduate degree. Many of them have postgraduate degrees. They think that is just the natural process of how everybody should be, forgetting the fact that we still need, construction workers and carpenters and carers and all sorts of things that don't require degrees. So there's been a huge neglect in the UK of traditional manual skills. We have a huge crisis of recruitment in the care industries because far too many of our children have gone to university. We need clever people, obviously. We need people with graduate expertise, but we don't need, as Tony Blair famously made a speech in 1999 saying we must send 50% of all our school leavers to university. I mean, apart from anything else, I thought it was incredibly emotionally insensitive because, whether one likes it or not, particularly when relatively few people went to university, going to university is a high status thing. When I went to university, only 8 or 10% of school leavers went to university. But when 8, 10, even 15% of people go to university and you don't, it's not a disaster. You probably think, well, the cleverest people in my class at school went to university, so what? You go on and work in an office or a factory in your town, life goes on. When 50% of people go to university and you don't, you are a second-class citizen. It was very badly thought through. Then, as you mentioned, there's the whole question of relatively open borders. We know that open borders are far more, not open borders, but relatively open, but high levels of mass immigration tend to benefit employers, tend to benefit more affluent people, and are competition for ordinary people. We've had a great liberalisation of views. I mean, the racial hostility to mass immigration, although it exists still, is now a very, very small reason for objecting to it in the UK. People object to it partly on the grounds that it's, back to anywhere, somewhere. Society is changing too fast. Your neighbourhood is changing too fast. Suddenly it fills up with people speaking a language that you don't understand, with cultural reference points that you no longer share. You can't have a chat with somebody at the bus stop because you can't speak a language. This is discomforting to most people. And again, anywhere people were not sufficiently acknowledging of this truth. Then, of course, there is the whole issue of national borders themselves and the extent to which you prioritise national sovereignty, the rights of national citizens before universal rights, citizens of other countries. And of course, our dominant sort of technocratic anywhere class has been very bound into international regulations, international institutions like the EU and so on. Obviously, we need international regulations, we need international bodies, but it's a question of the balance between national sovereignty and supranationalism. And I think for most people, the balance has got out of kilter. Family policy is another example one might cite. Family policy in the UK is essentially gender equality policy, as we were saying earlier. It's about making it as easy as possible for both parents to spend as little time in the family as possible. That isn't a very sensible family policy. You're making a better fist of that here in Hungary at the moment. But you are also doing it in a culture which is very gender equal. I mean, this may in a way be one of the inheritances of the socialist period, say compared to southern European countries that, the Italies and Spains that have a much more chauvinistic culture still than Hungary does, and where it's far harder for women to be equal and to be mothers, to be equal, in the professional rat race with men and to be mothers. But I was very glad to see when I went to Cinch, am I pronouncing it correctly? Kinch, sorry, that at the same time that you've been making this huge investment in family life and raising your fertility rate, the proportion of women in full-time employment has gone up and up and up. It's gone from 55% to 74% or something in recent times. So I think the kind of Handmaid's Tale caricature of Hungary that you sometimes hear in progressive circles in Western Europe is a complete nonsense. But anyway, so that just to give you a few examples of the way in which, sort of cultural biases turn into policies that very large minorities, if not majorities, of the British electorate thought were not in their interests. But the problem was, again, I come back to this point, it's not so much that any of these particular attitudes are kind of particularly monstrous, it's just that they were over-dominant in both of the main political parties. I mean, this is the problem of the underrepresented. I mean, it's the politics of my book really is about the problem of the underrepresentation of the somewhere worldview in modern Western politics. And it's a peculiar feature of Western politics in this recent period, I think, that it's what I call the problem of the missing majority, that there is, you can kind of work out roughly, it's not true probably of all countries in the, broadly speaking, the West, but I think most countries you could pretty easily establish an electoral majority based around a kind of economics that was a little bit to the left, meaning sort of social democratic but pro-market, and social and cultural policies, which would include things like, having clear national borders, not having excessive immigration, having a proper family policy, having social and cultural policies that lean a little bit to the right, albeit within the framework of what I call the great liberalisation on race and gender and homosexuality and so on. And there aren't any parties anywhere that represent this sort of combination. Well, perhaps in Hungary, I don't know. I mean, all the parties of the centre-left pretty much in the rich world went off in a very culturally liberal direction in the 70s and 80s and never really came back. I mean, and indeed are often going further and further. Look at trans policy in lots of countries being driven mainly by the left. And the parties of the right, it's probably easier for parties of the centre-right to combine, to make that kind of combination, a little bit to the left on economics, a little bit to the right on culture. It's probably easier for parties of the left, for parties of the right, or rather it's easier for parties of the right to move a little bit to the left on economics than it is for parties of the left to move a little bit to the right on cultural and social issues, if you get what I mean. But it is a sort of, why, I mean, and the truth is that it's populist parties that have often filled that vacuum. They have filled the vacuum of the missing majority, often in incoherent or unattractive ways. But they've been, if you look at the sort of policy agenda of something like the, what are they called, Rassemblement National, I mean, that's the sort of zone that they're representing, because none of the traditional mainstream parties of centre-left or centre-right in most, at least in most Western European countries, have occupied it.
But wasn't it this tendency towards more liberal policies as a result of East-West divide, as the West defined itself as free Europe and labeled the Eastern European communisms as barracks, which meant that everything which is related to liberty, more freedom, is a better and progressive way of living, while all the traditional introvertal things belong to the to dictatorships and closed societies and so on and so forth. So the whole terms, I mean all these groups of terms of traditionality, closed borders, closed communities, so on and so forth, became contaminated basically as phenomena of communism, a kind of everyday communism. In 1990, all the Hungarian political parties were liberal parties, basically. I mean, Fidesz as well as MDF and Free Democrats, and even the socialists were liberals, because that was the antithesis of the communism. So probably that was, and the 70s and the 80s were the decades of success in the West European countries. Even the welfare state, except for the UK, but even the welfare states in the 70s and the 80s were very successful. So they find the Holy Grail, the history. So the end of history, of course, it ends up in overall well-being, democratic stability, Western type of democratic societies, and so on and so forth. So there was the promise of solving all the problems of the humanity by political means. Politics were the key to the world.
Yeah, well, I'd slightly disagree with your timing. So, the Trente Glorieuses, the 30 sort of glorious years of post-war growth was really from the 50s to the 70s. And actually things started breaking down in the 70s and the 80s. If you remember, we had hyperinflation, we had the 1973 oil crisis. And then, at least in the Anglo-Saxon world, we had kind of Reagan, Thatcher came along with a free market answer. And Western Europe with a more diluted version, perhaps, of the same thing. But I think you're absolutely right, about the secular worldview. The secular worldview that prioritizes openness, that prioritizes freedom and individual autonomy above all else, has been completely absorbed into the progressive worldview. I mean, this is kind of one of the ironies of, you describe anywhere and somewhere priorities and values, and you think of anywheres. Obviously, there are lots of very privileged anywheres. There's an overlap between kind of anywhere thinking and sort of investment banking thinking, if you like, rather conveniently, because it means investment bankers can sort of claim to be on the right side of history in a kind of anywhere sense. But it's sort of culturally and socially anyway more associated with the left, and yet it's so individualistic. One of the other ways, very useful ways, I think, of thinking about the distinction that doesn't come from me, but from the American sociologist, long dead, called Tulker Parsons. Very, very boring sociologist, but he did come up with this really useful distinction of achieved identities and ascribed identities. And achieved identities, we all have a mixture of the two. We're all on a spectrum between the two, but the achieved identity, most anywheres have achieved identities, is basically for people who do well in life. You do well at school, you pass exams, you go to university, you have a more or less successful professional career. So your sense of yourself comes from your own achievements, I mean, partly correctly. And that means you have an identity that is very portable, that it can sort of fit in anywhere. You can live in the inner city, in the kind of edgy inner city, and surrounded by people who come from different cultures from you, and feel perfectly comfortable. But most people's identity are predominantly ascribed identities, things about yourself that you can't change. You're white, you're male, you're a certain age, you come from a certain place, you belong to a certain group. If more of your identity comes from these things, then significant change to your society or your place, your group, can be very discomforting because your identity is bound up with places and groups, and therefore, you find, free movement from the European Union can suddenly be rather unsettling. There's a whole area, a whole street next to you which is full of Polish people. You don't necessarily have any hostility to individual Polish people, but suddenly your whole neighborhood has changed, and that, if you have a predominantly ascribed identity, that affects you more than the people who kind of float above you with their portable achieved identities. How did I get onto that? I can't remember. The irony that that the Anywhere flag is a flag of the left when it's so individualistic, and it places freedom. Freedom is obviously a brilliant idea, as you know, in Hungary, perhaps more than we do in the UK. But you can't have freedom alone. I mean, there is nothing that makes you less free than having a baby. There are, you need freedom, but you need constraints, and otherwise society breaks down. But freedom is this roaring force that that over-dominates modern Western secular culture.
Yeah, and for instance, communitarianism, which just lived in high times in the early 90s, was translated into Hungarian as collectivism and as a legacy of communism. So you're absolutely right. It was progressive to be individualistic, because that was the antithesis of communism. But I think if we just survive this period, all these terms will be detoxicated. So communitarianism can get the real definition and the real meaning of the word, and we can use this, and that's the reason for the liberal withdrawal now, that conservatism, social democracy, Christian democracy is just getting back their own meaning of the word. And so that's after 1990, the Central European countries were all liberal countries. Liberalism was an overwhelming feeling just because as a reaction to communism. But now there's less and less liberalism in these countries, because we are just going back to the historical traditions. We are just we are now understand the real meaning of these terms. Liberalism is different now than it was in 1990, and so on and so forth. So that's really, it might be that some anywheres returns to be somewheres, just because as a life experience, political socialization, or a kind of progress in political developments, and so on and so forth. So.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting idea. I mean, society can only bear a certain proportion of anywheres, otherwise things break down. And actually, something I talked about in the book I wrote after The Road to Somewhere, called Head, Hand, Heart, The Struggle for Dignity and Status in the 21st Century. And I talk in that book about the sort of second great anywhere democratic failure, or what I regard as a democratic failure. I mean, in the Road to Somewhere, I talk about, well, broadly speaking, about anywheres being too comfortable with social change and being insufficiently empathetic to the majority of their fellow citizens who weren't comfortable with it, represented in many ways, like mass immigration and so on. In the Head, Hand, Heart, I focused on what I think is also another democratic failure, which is the overvaluation of one form of human aptitude, the kind of cognitive analytical exam passing kind. And we, like so often in human affairs, we kind of overshoot. We did need more university graduates in the 1980s and the 1990s, far too few people went to university when I did. But we overshot. We've now overproduced university graduates, and we've discovered also the knowledge economy turns out not to need very many knowledge workers. You know, it'll be even worse when AI really gets going. So there'll be a whole. We've produced a whole generation of people. We've raised their expectations to think that they can walk into the high-status, professional, well-paid jobs that they see on the television, and actually they can't, and they are often perhaps people from lower social classes, the first in their family ever to go to university. They've had this great promise of they're a graduate, and it's raised their expectations that we cannot fulfill. They're not going to get those well-paid, high-status professional jobs. They're going to be working for $25,000 in a $25,000, $30,000 a year in a kind of backroom job that they might lose to AI any moment. And I think that's produced its political. I mean, I think things like the Corbyn movement in Britain or the Bernie Sanders movement, it's usually driven by younger people. I think often sort of disappointed graduates who, and increasingly maybe those people will start to think that actually, many of the anywhere promises were sort of false ones, and that there are other futures to think about. Did you want to get a word in?
It's interesting you both gentlemen mentioned the proportion of anywheres and somewheres in the world. If we look at the cultural direction in which Western society is heading, for example, the dilemma of trans rights, mass immigration, woke politics, and the dominance of cancel culture, it appears that the proportion of somewheres is growing rapidly amongst voters. What do you think this tells us about European leading politicians who are often claimed to suffer from a lack of genuine legitimacy?
Do you mean anywhere numbers are growing quickly? Right?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. Do you want to go? Shall I? Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of the things you mentioned are a kind of expression of identity politics, often from young people who are growing up in a very liberal culture with relatively few boundaries, whether it's to do with sexuality, whether it's literally national and geographical boundaries. That growing up in a very fluid world is actually a very disturbing thing, and the people that proclaim a desire for fluidity and everything are actually expressing this in a way that, in a sense, undercuts their idea of fluidity, because they hold these ideas with such sort of venomous force that because they have become, lacking, as it were, kind of more normal identities, they're seeking identities in other ways, and that has produced some of the excesses of so-called woke politics. So, yeah, I mean, I think it is partly a product of the dominance of higher education in our cultures. Actually, I mean, universities have just been, growing like mushrooms everywhere, and we need universities, but they tend to be dominated by a certain very liberal mindset, hostile to authority, hostile to tradition, which in a way is kind of what universities should be. But when that impulse becomes too dominant, and as I was just saying, I think that we've produced disappointed expectations, and people who have unmarketable generalist academic skills are out there feeling lost. And actually, meanwhile, we have, again, speaking about the UK, not necessarily for Hungary, we have these massive problems of recruitment in skilled manual and technical jobs. We don't, we're complaining about not having enough houses built in the UK. We don't have the people to build them. and we will have to import people to build houses because these are good, well-paid jobs that lots of people would like to do if given the opportunity to do them. And it would also, a skilled job also often makes you kind of, rooted in particular places in a way that sort of generalist academic qualifications have that sort of universal aspect to them.
I think the fundamental paradox of the European integration that, according to the belief of the founding fathers, European integration can be successful only to a degree where they can isolate from the public mood, because their experience was that public mood can be excessive. It can be either far right or far left, and it can endanger European civilization. So in order to save the European civilization, to go beyond the problems and conflicts of nation states, they have to build up an artificial identity, a technocratic, a tactical one, and later, when it becomes popular, it can be popularized, building down the roots of this identity. But this design and this plan failed during decades. And now I think the problem of democratic legitimacy is not a problem of the relations of the EU institutions, but it's a problem of the lack of a democratic community at European level. And the real question of democratic legitimacy is it possible or it's impossible to build up a supranational democratic community? For instance, they often refer to the American experience, the nation, of freedom and nation of liberty, which is not based on ethnic lines. However, we can witness nowadays the developments in the US politics, which is just going closer and closer to the ethnic divisions and language and cultural divisions in the US politics. But that's the real issue. If there is an opportunity or possibility to build up an artificial identity at European level or not. And I think by your definition, it would be an anywhere identity. And it's not a somewhere identity. But the big question is it possible to define an identity on the principles of anywhereism? Or to be...
But, I mean, surely both anywhereism and somewhereism always exist in particular societies, which means in particular nation states. I mean, they are an argument within a national identity, really, aren't they?
That's true for nation states. Well, what if we want to have a European identity? Can we is there any kind of somewhereism at European identity, or there's no such place as Europe? From the question of, from the point of view of identity.
Well, we don't believe in all that stuff. There's no point thinking about it. I mean, we think it's impossible. We believe in the nation state. Obviously, you need, international regulations. You need good relations between nation states. You need institutions like the EU, not necessarily in its current form, but the nation state is absolutely destined to be with us in 100 years, 500 years. I mean, just in the next few decades, I can think off the top of my head of at least 3 reasons why it's going to be more important than it was probably 20 years ago. One of that is aging societies. Aging societies requires huge transfers, tax and benefit transfers, mainly from younger people to older people. Why would you do that except that you have this mysterious thing in common called national citizenship? Climate change, huge potential burden sharing. How much do better off people pay for use of continuing carbon use or whatever. How do we share the burden of climate change? And then the other thing, which perhaps doesn't apply so much to Hungary, but certainly applies to the UK, and certainly, as you have mentioned, to America, dealing with ethnic diversity. When white people cease to be a majority in America or in the UK, which is not that far away, we need something else to hold us together, and all belonging to the same national community with a shared history, a language, and so on. We can argue about the history. I don't mind arguing about the history, but we have a history to argue about, and that everybody, whatever ethnicity they are, takes part in that argument. We need the nation state more than ever.
Yeah, that's true. And if it's true, that means that democratic legitimacy of EU institutions is a hopeless exercise, because there's no democratic community behind that. So European democracy as such, it's not a project, or at least a very, very long-term project might be.
Yeah. Well, it was always a mistake to create the European Parliament. I mean, we should have thought about better ways of representing national parliaments in Brussels. But anyway.
Yeah. Okay, that's the point of the Hungarian government as well. So.
Exactly. Unfortunately, our time is running out, so there's time for one last question, Mr. Goodhart. There is much talk surrounding you that you have plenty of grand ideas regarding future projects that might touch upon topics such as European fertility, the importance of family and demography in general. Considering the fact that you're here in Hungary, one of the last countries in Europe that has a signature family policy and has declared a war on population decline, how much of an inspiration could our country prove to be for you?
Well, as I've said, I've had my briefing already today from the authorities, and I think you're ahead of the curve, definitely. I mean, I've noticed just in the last few months, the whole world, at least my little bubble, media bubble, people have suddenly woken up to the fact that we are suffering a huge fertility collapse, and that this is going to create as many, if not more, problems than the overpopulation that we were worrying about just yesterday. We are heading to these kind of inverted pyramids of relatively small numbers of people of working age. How do you sustain our current standards of living with this sort of demographic collapse? And of course, why has this been happening? Partly because of the prioritization of freedom and autonomy. Like I said earlier, nothing makes you less autonomous than having a baby, whether you're a woman or a man, assuming that you're a man who shares responsibility. I wrote partly about this in my last book, Head, Hand, Heart, the heart part of it, but I want to dig deeper into the story of basically how do we invest sufficiently in the care that we need. By care, I mean the care in the domestic realm, having babies, looking after children, looking after old people, both in the domestic realm and in the public economy. We're struggling to produce enough babies. We're struggling to recruit people in these care jobs. And of course, one of the reasons for that is that this negative thing is the result of a positive thing, which is that women are free now not to care. They're free not to have babies. There's a brilliant quote from an American academic called Amy Wax, who says that care is, I've got it here, care is undersupplied in our societies because it has positive externalities for society, positive benefits for society that cannot be captured by the caregiver. This problem used to be solved by restricting women's opportunities to do anything else. Having largely relaxed those restrictions, we don't have an alternative and are living with the consequences. And I think she puts her finger on it in a way. That how can we have sufficient investment in care and equality? And I think, as I was saying earlier, I think you have a kind of advantage here in some ways because of the kind of equality norm that you've received from the socialist period. So it doesn't. So you're thinking about family and how to support family and produce more babies happens within the. This is what I think people on the left in Western Europe don't get about Hungary. You're actually a pretty sex equal society. And as I was saying, the numbers for female employment have been rising at the same time that you have managed to buck the trend and increase your fertility rate. But I think this is still regarded. We don't really have family policy in the UK at all, or anything like the kind you do. It's clearly incredibly expensive. I mean, you spend 5% of your GDP on encouraging people, making it easier for people to have children and look after them. But I think it's an incredibly good investment, and I think a lot of other countries will be following you quite soon. I hope, including the UK.
And let me add that we don't even have sexes in Hungarian language.
You don't have sexes?
No.
Oh.
So it's just an equal language.
Mr. Goodhart, Minister Navracsics, our time has unfortunately run out. Thank you very much for this fruitful conversation. It was a great pleasure to speak to you, gentlemen. Kedves vendégeink, az időnk sajnos lejárt, köszönjük a megtisztelő figyelmüket.